The treasure of my grandmother. Many years ago, this incident occurred. I was a child when my father told my siblings and me the story of what happened to my grandmother, his mother, in her home in the city of Mexico, where my aunt, her sister, also lived. I must mention that my father's entire family originated from Pachuca, Hidalgo, specifically from Real del Monte, a beautiful place that holds many legends and tales of witches, elves, and more. However, what happened to my grandmother was an event that we still discuss when some cousins and siblings gather to this day. When I was a child, I would usually go with my father to visit my grandmother. She was already an elderly woman with advanced age, and as far back as I can remember, she was blind. She had been living with this disability for years, which is important to note in this story. She lost her sight when she was a mature woman, and for this reason, she stayed to live with my Aunt Margarita. She had always been a hard worker in Hidalgo, and after becoming a widow, she took care of her children. In an effort to provide them with a better life, she decided to move to the city of Mexico, where they established themselves. In Pachuca, they had a small house that my grandfather had left them. However, it had become increasingly difficult for my grandmother to stay there for any longer. Although my father was the eldest among his siblings and helped support the family, they couldn't remain in Pachuca any longer because there were several siblings and expenses were high. So, one day, my grandmother informed them that she planned to sell her little house. This would provide them with the means for their relocation and to rent a small room. Thus, all that was left was to support her. What my father told us was that when he returned from work, my grandmother had already packed everything. He didn't know how, but they were ready to migrate to the capital, and naturally, the older siblings supported her because they all wanted to improve their lives. Years went by, and as time passed, my aunts and uncles got married. Unfortunately, my grandmother gradually lost her sight. Of all my father's siblings, he was the only one who visited his hometown regularly, as he called it. Unfortunately, he couldn't go to their old family house every time, but they did visit nearby places on outings. After all, he didn't miss an opportunity to return to his homeland, as he used to say. As the years went by and my father's siblings got married, my grandmother had no other option but to take refuge with my aunt and live with her, just a couple of blocks away. Meanwhile, on the other side, there were occasions when my siblings couldn't accompany us, and it was my turn to go with my father to the village because he needed to sort out some personal documents for his work and other matters. I loved taking the bus, looking out the window at the beautiful landscapes. I will never forget that we would stop to have a delicious barbacoa, which we would later share with my mother and siblings when we returned home. I also can't forget the disturbing incident that happened in my family. But as the years passed, my aunt told my father about a situation happening in her house with my grandmother. She claimed to hear her talking to someone. This couldn't be because she was alone in her room. My cousins and my uncle weren't there either. Frankly, it was quite unnerving because in that house, there were only those two women entirely on their own. Initially, they thought that maybe she was talking loudly due to her condition. Sometimes, while my aunt was preparing food, she would peek into my grandmother's room to see if she was okay or if she was talking to her. She would find my grandmother peaceful. At times, they would turn on the radio, thinking that my grandmother might be commenting on the program she was listening to. So, time passed with this situation. During previous visits, my aunt had never mentioned anything about it. She kept it to herself until she couldn't bear the fear anymore. They talked about many things. I remember watching them and listening attentively to learn more about their lives in that isolated village when they were children. My father told her how everything had changed. On one occasion, I couldn't accompany my father to Pachuca. He had gone to obtain some birth certificates, and I knew I would miss that trip. I had things to do and couldn't go with him. When he returned to our home in the city, we were in for a surprise. He told us that he had to go back because there were several other things he had to do. He also mentioned with great enthusiasm that he had met the people who had been his neighbors when he was a child. Friends from the community, if any of you come from the countryside, I imagine you know how warm and kind people can be. He couldn't resist stopping to chat with them and reminisce about the old times, because when my father left with his family, he was barely 10 years old. The neighbors remembered him well and his parents. Everything was fine up to that point. However, they did tell him to drop by when he had the chance to go back to visit the house that had been his. It's worth mentioning that his parents' house had been sold to acquaintances, so that day he found out that they still lived there. Months later, after learning more about my grandmother's condition, we returned to the village. I remember my aunt sitting by her stove in a very old and worn-out chair, holding a rolled-up white handkerchief in her hands, which she used to wipe away tears when nervousness or fear overcame her. Amidst sobs, she told my father that my grandmother continued to talk to herself, but it worried her and frightened her because she had now had the opportunity to see her talking and gesturing to someone, as if signaling them to leave. She was very concerned because she thought it might be a sign of illness. My grandmother had never behaved like this before, and there was no apparent reason for her to be doing this. My aunt felt guilty because perhaps she didn't spend enough time with my grandmother, and there were times when they left her alone. My mother would visit her when she went to the market, but they could only talk through the window facing the street. It's worth mentioning that they lived on the ground floor, and there was a kind of balcony where my grandmother could hear my mother and have conversations. This way, she didn't have to get out of bed for anything. In the evening, when my father came home from work, my mother would tell him how my grandmother was doing. During their conversations, my father couldn't keep the secret of what was happening to my grandmother any longer, and he told my mother. When she found out, she became very worried. From that moment on, when she stopped by to check on my grandmother, she would see if she was okay, but didn't hear her talking to anyone. My father told her that not only had my aunt heard her talking to someone she couldn't see, but now my cousins had noticed it too. So, something was indeed happening. Cautiously, my father planned to ask my grandmother about it during their next visit, so that she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. The next Saturday arrived, and my father finally spoke with her, but he could never have anticipated what she would reveal regarding who, or rather, what the visitors disturbing my grandmother were. When he felt a bit calmer and less nervous, my father told us about their conversation. He asked my grandmother if she was fine, if there was anyone bothering her or making her uncomfortable in the house, and if everything was going well. He mentioned that her sister had found her somewhat upset on a few occasions and wanted to know if it was because of them, if they were taking care of her properly, or if she needed something. To my father's surprise, her response left him shocked. My grandmother said that she was fine, and it wasn't anyone in the family who was bothering her. On the contrary, she had no complaints about them. She simply didn't like being alone. She understood that everyone had to go out to do their activities or attend their jobs, but what made her uncomfortable were the 3 people who were bothering her. She was tired of telling them that she didn't have what they were looking for and that they insisted too much. She emphasized that 2 of them, in particular, were the problem. My father fell silent and thoughtful. When he discussed it with his sister, she replied that no one entered their home except for some known neighbors, friends, family members, and my cousin's boyfriend. No one went into my grandmother's room, and this is where things took a strange and unsettling turn. It didn't match what my grandmother and my aunt were saying. I must admit that even my parents began to doubt my aunt. Perhaps, due to her activities, she left my grandmother alone for too long, and some malicious person from the neighborhood was bothering her. That's what they needed to find out. What my grandmother mentioned was that she didn't feel or hear the front door opening, and certainly not the door to her room. Despite her poor eyesight, she could describe these individuals as tall, black silhouettes that could pass through walls at first. Another curious or chilling detail was that she noticed a peculiar smell when these people arrived. My grandmother described it as the smell of sulfur. To avoid worrying her, my father told her that they would talk to the landlord and arrange a meeting with the neighbors to request that they control their children to stop bothering her. And so they did, but no one had children with the characteristics my grandmother mentioned. Initially, she only heard them talking to her, but she didn't hear anyone opening the door. They were there with her, asking for things she had repeatedly told them she didn't have and insisting too much. More specifically, my grandmother emphasized that 2 of them were the main culprits. What surprised all of us was that my grandmother described the 3 people to my father as if she were seeing them. In fact, she narrated the physical characteristics of these three individuals who visited her. After their visits, during which she only saw dark silhouettes, something strange started happening. Although she recognized us by our voices and our outlines, when those people came, her vision improved enough to notice certain details. She told my father that the men were dressed in dark suits with hats, very elegant, and the woman wore a long dress and gloves, as if they were in mourning, she said. She even described them physically. One of the men was dark-skinned, the other was fair, just like the woman. This struck us as very strange. So my father asked her how it was possible that she could see them when my aunt and cousins never saw anyone. They only saw her gesturing as if she were talking to someone. My grandmother told my father that she didn't know, but she could see them, and they were asking her for money she didn't have. She told them that they must be confusing her with someone else, that she didn't have anything of theirs, that she didn't know them, and she told them to leave her alone. But they always came back. There was one more unsettling fact that my grandmother revealed that afternoon. She said that the three individuals bothering her for her possessions were two men and one woman. Even though she could hardly see anything anymore, she could identify them by their voices. What worried us was that she described them physically, as if she were seeing them, and she described the characteristics of these three people who visited her. After those initial visits, during which she only saw dark silhouettes, something strange began to happen. While she could identify us primarily by our voices and shapes, when these people came, her vision improved enough to see certain details. She described the men as dressed in dark suits with hats, very elegant, and the woman in a long dress with gloves, as if they were in mourning. She even provided physical descriptions. One man was dark-skinned, the other was fair, just like the woman. This puzzled us greatly. My father asked her how it was possible for her to see them when my aunt and cousins never saw anyone. They only witnessed her gesturing as if she were talking to someone. My grandmother told my father that she didn't know, but she could see them, and they were asking her for money she didn't have. She told them that they must be confusing her with someone else, that she didn't have anything of theirs, that she didn't know them, and she told them to leave her alone. But they always came back. What made my father and the rest of the family even more perplexed was that they had never seen these visitors at any point, even when my grandmother clearly described them to my father. This situation had everyone in the family deeply troubled. After speaking with my grandmother, they pondered how to prevent these unsettling events from continuing and disturbing her. They still found it hard to believe that she could see and converse with these people, especially since her eyesight had deteriorated significantly and they were persistently demanding money she did not possess. These visitors appeared to be persistent debt collectors, but my grandmother had never had such money to owe anyone. However, the situation took an unusual turn. A couple of years later, my grandmother passed away from this world, and 2 years after that, my mother also departed. Yet, the peculiar occurrences didn't come to an end. Several more years would pass before we experienced another surprise. On another occasion, when my father had to return to his hometown to settle additional documents, I couldn't accompany him due to my job. He told us something we could hardly believe. This time, my father did what his acquaintances had been suggesting for years. He visited the house that had once belonged to our family. During this trip, he unexpectedly ran into an old friend from his youth who had recently returned to the town. My father was pleased to see her, as he had heard that she had married after he left Pachuca and hadn't lived in the town for many years. However, circumstances had brought her back, just as they had brought my father for this visit. After completing his errands and revisiting his hometown, he decided to make a stop at the house he used to call home, intending to reminisce and see if it still belonged to the family to whom his mother had sold it many years ago. My father described the experience, explaining that when he arrived at the address, he expected to see some changes, as many things had evolved over the years in Pachuca. Perhaps some improvements or alterations had taken place since his family had left, as the house was not in bad shape, and it was relatively spacious. He had mentally prepared himself for the possibility of drastic changes, but what he actually witnessed left him petrified and puzzled. What he saw was completely different from what he remembered. Instead of the small house they had sold, he was standing in front of an enormous and elegant mansion. The house looked nothing like the one his family had inhabited. Perplexed, he approached the door and rang the bell, doubting if he had the correct address. However, it was indeed the right place. While waiting, he pondered if he might be intruding, and just as he was about to leave, the door opened. To his delight, the person who answered was the son of the couple to whom my grandmother had sold the house. They warmly greeted each other. My father and this man had known each other as teenagers, but were now mature adults, approaching the later stages of their lives. They embraced cordially, and the man invited my father into the house. My father described the place, stating that it was remarkably different from what he had remembered, with no resemblance to the house his family had once owned. The man guided my father into a beautiful garden at the back of the house, where my father was taken aback to find a pool. The pool wasn't large, but it was a testament to the extensive renovations that had been made to the property. After a lengthy conversation in which they caught up on their lives and family developments, they discussed the house. My father complimented the man on how beautiful it looked, far different from the house his mother had sold to his parents. The man acknowledged the compliment and explained that his parents had carried out several renovations. They had invested considerable money in expanding and upgrading the house. My father remarked that his parents must have worked very hard to achieve such a transformation. To this, the man replied that it wasn't entirely due to their hard work. He then asked my father if he had never heard about what was concealed inside the house. My father was taken aback, confessing that he hadn't known about it. After his father's passing, he had focused on working to support his family, leaving little time to explore or discover things in the house. In recent years, his mother spent most of her time there, as he was working in the mines to support his siblings. The man went on to tell my father about events that occurred after they moved to the capital city and his parents started living in the house. On occasion, they heard strange noises within the house and even heard voices, but they didn't attach much importance to these occurrences. They chalked them up to the age of the house, as it was widely believed in Pachuca that such old houses were home to various supernatural beings, including duendes, sprites. In fact, Pachuca even had a museum dedicated to these creatures. However, something unexpected happened that they couldn't dismiss. They decided to make some minor alterations to the house. They knocked down a wall and began lifting part of the floor. One night, as his mother got up, she noticed a small, faint blue light coming from the hole they had opened in the floor. The next day, she told her husband about it, worried that it might be a problem. They decided to investigate further and dug deeper into the hole they had created. What they discovered left them in shock, a battered, ancient pot filled with gold coins. The coins were clearly old and valuable. Over time, they gradually unearthed more coins. With the discovered treasure, they finished the renovations in the house and started some businesses. Throughout the years that his grandparents lived there, as well as my father and his siblings, they had no idea that a treasure was hidden within the house. My father, once the shock had worn off, insisted that the treasure was meant for them because if it had been for his family, they would have discovered it. However, my father firmly believed that it wasn't theirs to claim. This conviction was something he reiterated whenever he recounted this story to us. When my father shared this with us, we were left in awe, especially when we learned that buried treasures indeed exist, and there was one in my grandmother's house. We came to echo my father's sentiment: it wasn't meant for the family. This belief was something we reiterated once we became aware of my grandmother's experiences with entities who demanded that she reveal the location of her money and return what was supposedly theirs, even though she had no knowledge of the gold they sought. My grandmother never knew about the treasure that was hidden in her house. As I mentioned earlier, she passed away years before my father visited what had once been their family home. None of us could have imagined such a treasure, let alone that the previous owners would return from the afterlife to request it from my grandmother. In the end, we came to understand that they approached her because she had been the owner of that house, the first person to imbue that land with her energy and vibration, transforming it into a home. These entities seemed to believe that she had somehow taken the treasure, which was not the case. The lingering mystery for our entire family was the identity of the original owners of that treasure. Were the three individuals who followed my grandmother for so many years the previous owners of the land? But most perplexing of all was how my nearly blind grandmother could see and perfectly describe these three people, converse with them, and even express her anger at being asked for something she was unaware of, which we later discovered was the treasure left in the Pachuca house. These are answers we will never have, as my grandmother took them to her grave. Now we know that treasures exist, and their owners may return. We also recognize that we may unknowingly guard these treasures, as my grandmother did, only for them to eventually find their way into the hands of their rightful owners. A story based on real events, written for Dark Secret by Jemisha, the goddess of darkness.